Hi, everybody. Quick switch over. How are you guys doing? Thanks so much for joining me. If you guys are just joining the stream now, hi, my name is Marilyn, and I'm the CEO and founder of Cosmic Centaurs. And this is the closing debate of our second annual Cosmic Conference. This year, we chose to discuss the impact of the pandemic on team dynamics, and what better way to close this off than to have the mother of all debates about whether or not remote teams are better. And that'll be the motion in question. And underpinning this debate as a report we've been busy working on, we put out a survey, 300 respondents, and a lot of the motions that we'll be discussing today with our three incredible guests are actually the key themes of that upcoming report. So let me introduce everybody really quickly. So first off, we have Joe Santos, a dear friend and a professor from INSEAD. He's the affiliated professor of practice and global management, and after spending 20 years in the managerial world, Joe moved from Italy to INSEAD and devoted himself to scholarly work, a dream from his youth. Joe's research and teaching focuses on the management of the multinational enterprise, and particularly on the management of global integration and global innovation. Next up is Liam Martin. Liam is a serial entrepreneur, an avid remote work proponent. He runs Time Doctor, a popular time tracking and productivity software platform, and Staff.com for hiring remote staff. He is also a co-organizer of the world's largest remote conference, Running Remote. And last but not least, Paul McKinlay. He's VP of Communications and Remote Working at Cimpress, the parent company to e-commerce brands like Vistaprint. He's been leading employee communications, change, engagement, and L&D teams, both in-house and in agency, for over 20 years. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's fantastic to be here.
Wonderful. Our pleasure and privilege.
All right, let me explain how this is going to work then. So all the other sessions were panels. We were being very, disciplined and kind to each other. I'm hoping that this debate will get a little bit more heated. And the way that we're going to do this is we have 6 motions. I'm going to read out the motions, and I'm going to ask you whether you agree with the motion or disagree with the motion. I'll look at your screens, and then I'll pick one of you to kick things off. And then depending on your reactions, I'll pick the person who seems to disagree the most in order to argue the other side of the debate. So if you guys are ready for it, we can kick off our game, and I can start by reading out our first motion around communication and coordination. So coordination in teams is a function of knowledge sharing and communication. In a survey that we conducted around distributed teams, 42% of our respondents reported that the amount of communication they have with their teams increased and became overwhelming during the global pandemic. Here's the motion. So again, give me a thumbs up if you agree with our motion, or a thumbs down if you don't. Remote teams do not communicate and coordinate as effectively as co-located teams. That is because remote increases the need for deliberate actions towards staying connected with other team members. No average answers are allowed in this room. Oh my goodness. All right. Liam, since you haven't voted, I'll start with you.
I disagree with the premise of the question. So that's the variable that I'm concerned about. The assumption that more communication and collaboration is always the right direction inside of any team is an assumption that was built out of on-premise in-office environments. Remote teams have recognized it's not an all-you-can-eat buffet with regards to collaboration. It's an a la carte method, because you don't have to pay that price of everyone commuting in every single day in order to have that form of collaboration. So to me, a lot of the times we actually figure out how can we minimize the amount of collaboration, make that collaboration a lot more productive so that we can focus everyone in on achieving deep work throughout their workday. My friend Cal Newport has written a fantastic book on that subject. Anyone that has a remote team should definitely read it. And his belief is that if you can optimize everyone towards doing deep, insightful work, that's what's going to actually move your company forward, not, ironically, more collaboration.
Joe, I see you shaking your head. What do you think?
Well, I do agree with the motion in the general sense, but I would qualify the motion. We use the word teams too loosely. We call teams everything. We see 2 people, 3 people, we call it a team. And we absolutely need to distinguish between group work, which is an aggregation of individual work towards a certain task, and what I would call true teamwork, which is an emergence. And if teamwork is an emergence, meaning it is impossible to ascertain what contribution each person gave to the team, then yes, absolutely. That's one of the big limitations of being remote. So my general thesis is that if true teamwork is what you're looking for, remote work doesn't do it, period. If what you're looking for is group work, is the aggregation of individual work, then remote teams are fine. You may need to increase, then I agree with Liam. It really depends on the moment, the task at hand, the allocation of tasks to the people in the team. So I'll stay there. There's a different reason, and I hope I have time to come back to it, which is deeper, which is that when we use technology to mediate communication and coordination, what we're actually doing is substituting time for space. And it is possible to substitute time for space. For example, we're meeting at a certain time, while in the past we would probably meet in a room. So yes, remote technology can substitute time for space, but technology cannot substitute time for place. You see, I'm in Lisbon. There's no way you get to understand where you are unless you're here. And time and technology do not substitute for place. Yes, space, not for place. And you know, when we contribute to a team, a lot of our contribution comes from our place, the place where we are, the context where we live and exercise our role in the team. Sorry for being long. I'll be quiet in the future. So
not at all. That's not why I asked you to join this debate. I think those are really very important points, and we'll come to them, especially the point of place when we talk about identity. Paul, you were somewhere in the middle on this. I think the point that Joe's making is around what is teamwork, and maybe you can talk towards, you know, your organization has moved, right, to having more remote work being part of it, maybe becoming remote first. Where has this worked and where has it not? You were somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say to start with, Marilyn, I know you set this up like some kind of UFC fight here, but I fully intend to be disciplined and kind through this conversation as well, just as part of the setup. Listen, I agree that without deliberate actions towards staying connected, remote teams can struggle. But 2 points to call out to start, rather than bring this up in every motion that comes up to follow. First, I think teams can be successful when working 100% in person or 100% remote if they have great leaders, great people, a great plan, and they execute that plan really well. And if one or more of those things is missing, problems arise wherever people are working. And I don't think success is about whether people are remote or not remote. Second, we all know this to be true. The last 15 months, we've unleashed millions of remote working newbies, including me, on each other with zero planning time. It's been carnage and amazing in equal proportion, sometimes at the same time. And companies like ours who made an early decision to make remote permanent have made huge strides, huge progress in creating a model and helping team members to be successful. So, I mean, this motion is really close to my heart as I lead both remote working and communications. I agree that remote creates the need for deliberate focus on connection. Remote also exposes the need for a new and different set of skills. And I know you were talking about that in the last conversation, which I really enjoyed, by the way, and seconded Erin Meyer's book. It's absolutely fantastic. When you see poor communication or ineffective coordination in a team, you should diagnose far deeper than whether this team is remote or not remote. If you unleashed a new hire in an office with no badge, no context, no colleagues, no laptop, no rule book, you get the results that you designed for. You wouldn't do that if you were based in an office. Why would you do that to a remote team member?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good segue actually to our second motion, which is around what information you know, right? That's kind of what you're pointing at, is it's also about giving people knowledge and context. And the next motion I want to bring up is one that is of a concept called mutual knowledge. So mutual knowledge is knowledge that is shared and known to be shared. And we know that teams that are distributed perform better when they have high levels of mutual knowledge. That is, that they know a lot about each other's contexts, be those personal contexts, like who you live with, who you care for, or be it skills context, like what are you good at doing, what do you enjoy doing, are you a morning or an evening person? We were talking about that kind of diversity earlier on. So here's our motion around mutual knowledge. Remote teams have weaker mutual knowledge than co-located teams. Effective communication and knowledge sharing can become a daunting task in virtual settings because of the nature of both the virtual context and the technology used to support it. It's harder to acquire mutual knowledge in virtual setups. Paul, I'll let you start.
Hey, by the way, I love Joe's last point that he made about location is so important. I would have that as a huge argument in favor of remote teams. You can bring people together to your team from all over the world with all of those different contexts and apply it to your problem. That kind of cognitive dissonance is so good for teams. I love the point, and I'd like to copy it on behalf of remote. In terms of this one, I think this motion is easily debunked. In a co-located setting, a new hire in, I don't know, Barcelona is unlikely to ever befriend a team member in Boston because of the construct of the office and the way relationships work. And remote brings people closer together. We remove walls, we remove distance, we've leveled the playing field for our team members. We used to be far more US centric than we are today. We used to be far more 10 people are in a room and one person on a screen. And we all know now how hideous that experience is. We've woken up to that in many ways. This feels harder because of all the new possibilities, though. It's like our brains can hardly handle the number of tools and the magnitude of the possibility. And I think this becomes then a question, a human question is, are we even prepared to continue to focus on building these relationships, or is it too overwhelming? It's a fantastic problem to have. I think the solution, as with all solutions, starts with a desired outcome. In this case, ensuring teams see the opportunity and have the tools and time to foster great relationships, which leads to great work.
Brilliant. Joe, you actually think the concept of mutual knowledge is something that remote teams will struggle with?
Yes. And that's, again, a limitation of, you can say it, human nature, or one of the great features of human nature, or of the technology. And I prefer to say it's a limitation of the technology, not of human nature. What makes us human is partly that most of what we know cannot be codified. And of course, if you're doing a task, like, I don't know, producing apps or doing some software work, then it's relatively easy that your knowledge is mostly codifiable. Actually, your task is to codify stuff. So in that sense, of course, you can be around the world and you can use people around the world and mostly do group work, carefully planned, like Paul said. But the point is, yeah, what about breakthrough innovations? What about the general management of companies? What about leading movements? What about the absolute requirement of context-specific knowledge that is not articulable, that is not codifiable? And by the way, the most important human knowledge that we call specific, tacit, is the collective knowledge that people call culture. And therefore, we have to think how much my contribution to the team is actually not my individual contribution, a characteristic of individualistic cultures, like the Anglo-Saxon cultures, for example, or am I bringing part of the context that I'm in to my contribution, which is, of course, a non-individualistic, a systemistic view of our knowledge and work. So I would say yes, absolutely, but careful, because if the most valuable knowledge you bring is uncodifiable, unarticulable, then you really have a problem and therefore mutual knowledge becomes a real problem, let alone the sharing and melding of uncommon knowledge, which is even worse, because I'm only valuable to a team if what I know is different from what the other people know. So, but most of my uncommon knowledge is place specific, it's history specific, and I can't bring that to a team if I can't say it, if I can't write it.
Liam, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. I mean, I'm sure through your conference and your work, you have worked with companies that maybe have been remote from day one, like the GitLabs of this world, and have managed to scale up without the need for ever being co-located. What are your thoughts around how these teams develop mutual knowledge?
Well, GitLabs is a perfect example of this. And I have never worked in an office, so I don't really have that context. However, recently I've been looking a lot more at the in-office environment. And one of the things that's really jumped out at me is the lack of sharing of knowledge, that sacred knowledge that in remote teams, at least successful ones, is freely shared because everyone knows that that's how you actually move the organization forward, versus the desire of the individual to be able to retain that sacred knowledge so that they're unfireable effectively inside of their organizations. And even if you take the context of, let's say, like a kitchen at a restaurant, the cook wouldn't protect the recipe, as an example, from the rest of the people in the kitchen. They would give that information freely. But in office environments, that's sometimes not the case. They want to be able to hold on to that information because it gives them some level of leverage inside of successful remote teams. And GitLab is a perfect example of this. Everything is built into process documentation. They have the largest remote work process document that's open sourced on planet Earth. It's 8,000 pages. It's about.gitlab.com/handbook. And there's absolutely everything there on how to run GitLab, and anyone can actually access it. And if you had all that information, you could run GitLab. It's the full recipe right there. Large corporations recognize this. And I think the forcing function that remote provides is you must actually produce all of this documentation because you don't have that co-location. It's a forcing function to allow people to say, yeah, we actually have to have all of that stuff written down. We have to have it documented somewhere. It has to be easy to understand by other people and consumable in a digital format. And that's the piece that if you've done that, mutual knowledge isn't necessarily a problem.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, at least about the piece of our knowledge that we are able to document. And I have to agree, in the corporate side of the world, I've seen the complete absence of discipline around even documenting what is known to everyone, even documenting what could be a process isn't done. There's no discipline around knowledge creation in many big and
I'll
great.
give you a perfect example. So we have meetings, and all of our meetings are documented. So at the end of every single meeting, if it's synchronous, meaning if it's over a Zoom call, we write down all of the major issues that we addressed and what the conclusions of those issues were, and they're posted to everyone inside of our organization. That's really not done as a practice in a lot of companies. And that's so refreshing for a lot of team members that are actually brand new to our company that come in and say, well, what do you mean I can see everything? Yes, you can see everything inside of our organization so that you don't have any informational disadvantage from any other team member, including the CEO of the company. And that's something that is a little bit difficult for people to figure out. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but once you overcome that, your organization moves a lot faster.
Yeah, I think the other side of this story, the point that Joe's making around this tacit knowledge is tacit that you wouldn't even be able to document because it's not knowledge that you're able to make explicit. Joe, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think those are two aspects that we can learn from both, right?
Absolutely. The GitLab is a remarkable example, which, by the way, I use when I teach multinational management, which is my field. And because multinational management is my field, not work, I have been studying virtual teams around the world since the early 90s, when they began. So remote teamwork is not new to multinationals. It has started 30 years ago. And some of us have devoted a lot of our time to study it, in particular virtual teamwork of management. There are companies where the top executive teams meet 2 or 3 times a year, physically co-located in a co-located fashion. And I've studied these companies and I know how they work. So, and GitLab is a great example. Why? Because GitLab is in a kind of business which experts in work, for example, in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, have shown can be done 100% remotely. Of course, if the kind of work you do can be done 100% remotely, my apologies. I was teaching virtually for a couple of hours, so my apologies for the state of mind. This is one of the problems of remote work. Anyway, sorry for that. So that was it. I completely agree. If the kind of work you do is of the kind of work that GitLab does, absolutely. Officeless companies do exist and will exist in particular lines of business. But even in those lines of businesses, breakthrough innovation will come because 2 or 3 people meet and something happens that wasn't supposed to happen, some serendipity moment. And that's when breakthrough innovation occurs. And that will not occur remotely. At least I've been looking for it for 25 years and I haven't found one. So, anyone that knows one, please let me know.
All right, I'm going to move us along to our next topic. This one is around psychological safety. So, of course, the psychological safety is not a recent concept. Amy Edmondson, was the first to kind of popularize it in her work with Google and Project Aristotle, and it is often cited as the highest kind of factor that correlates with team performance. You could say it's the belief that an individual will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or even mistakes. So the motion here is remote teams have less psychological safety than co-located teams. Psychological safety is harder to nurture since a significant amount of its drivers rely on in-person cues, body language, display of emotions, and it makes it harder for remote teams to tell how everyone else is feeling, let alone create psychological safety. All right. Wow, we have an interesting agreement here. Paul, maybe you want to kick us off.
Yeah, no problem. I'm on the fence. I'm sorry, I am on the fence. I disagree that remote teams feel less safe, but do agree that by default. But I do agree it's really important to be very thoughtful and deliberate about how people are feeling. But guess what? that should have always been the case, and now we have to ask people how they are and not accept that I'm fine, brush off. How often did we dig deeper into the how's it going that we use so much in the country that I'm in right now, the US, and as you walk past someone in a corridor, this is highly dependent in my mind on team and manager. And some in-office folks with great teams and great managers feel more safe in the office, and some in-office folks with toxic managers dread coming into the office, and a shift in manager changes that overnight, and it has nothing to do with either the office or being in your basement at home like I am today. I do agree that it's harder to create safety remotely because trust is harder to build virtually. That this is why it's vital to invest in-person events and collaboration as part of a remote model, which is exactly what we've done. And we totally see in-person collaboration and events as a big part of our future, even though team members who choose not to come to the office on a day-to-day basis do not have to.
I believe you're muted, Marilyn.
I am muted. Isn't that wonderful? Thank you, Liam. This had to happen at least once. So here we go. I was saying, thanks for that.
I hope you feel safe.
I do. Honestly, I everything has happened to me on a live. I've dropped off. A guest has dropped off. The internet has disappeared. There is nothing that can startle me at this point. But one thing did startle me is that Joe and Liam agreed on this motion. So maybe talk us through, Joe, what is psychological safety in your
quickly. First of all, individual level attributes are not my cup of tea. But I believe I can say something about location. Meaning, in my understanding, a lot of this psychological safety comes from us being able to understand the other, to empathize with the other, in particular if the other is in distress. And the problem is that a lot of, well, I'm on the fence like Paul, in the sense that if members of the team are from high context cultures, where the things that are important are not spoken, where if I feel unsafe, I'm not going to say it, because it's not what we do, then it's a problem. But if we come from low context cultures, it's fine. So we need to have some sensitivity about the local context, in particular the way we communicate, and the work of Hall that studied low context, high context. Because remember, in a culture like my own, I am Portuguese, what that means is that the important things are never written. They are, as we say, between the lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very beautiful point also about that diversity aspect, and we will not all respond to these things in the same way. I also come from a high context culture and have many times had to read between the lines. Liam, what are your thoughts around how do we create psychological safety? Maybe what are some of the practices that you've seen that enable remote teams to do that?
Sure. So first off, I think there is less psychological safety inside of remote teams than on-premise ones. One of the biggest ones was ones that we just touched on previously. The ability to be able to build process documentation inside of those teams means the hard skills inside of an organization are effectively replaceable. So the actual work, the widget that you make, is something that the company they can replace that individual relatively easily. It's more the soft skills, it's the EQ skills, it's understanding how to be able to move that team forward, it's understanding the innovation that you need, at least inside of a technology company, to be able to build different products and go in different directions inside of your organization that are really what we go after, at least for us. One of the questions that I ask every new interviewee in our company is the Peter Thiel question, which is, what is something that you believe that very few people agree with you on? The ability to be able to say, I agree that the sky is red instead of blue, is something that very few people will do, but those are the people that usually end up producing innovations inside of fast-growing organizations. In terms of just building more psychological safety, connected to Paul, we do team retreats every single year when it's not COVID. We run a conference about the company every single year. We fly people into one singular location. That creates a lot of psychological safety. And the other factor that is something that isn't really touched on that much is inside of remote first organizations, there's significantly less middle management than in on-premise organizations, because remote companies don't require the same level of management as on-premise teams. And that may also create some level of psychological safety where they're not maybe getting those check-ins as often as they would be. And the way that we solve for that is whenever we do managerial meetings with direct employees, one-on-ones, it's only about EQ. It's only about how you're doing. It's not about your work, because that can actually be reported to me asynchronously. I don't need to actually know how many widgets you produced. I want to know how you're feeling, so that we can make sure that you continue to produce those widgets into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And speaking of, some of the things that are much more difficult to do asynchronously, I want to take us to a motion around conflict and both engaging in and managing conflict. In one of our earlier panels, we had a question around that too, and yesterday actually, and we don't mean conflict necessarily in a bad way, because of course, as we know, conflict can also be very productive. Conflict is a natural element of team interactions. And we know, according to research from the Journal of Applied Psychology, that task conflict leads to better team performance, right? Now, conflict seems to prevail longer in virtual teams compared to co-located team, maybe because of their diverse nature, maybe because of increased impediments and gaps in communication or different work styles, or simply the fact that they tend to be much more multicultural. So the motion is remote teams are less likely to engage in and effectively manage conflict than co-located teams. This is because individuals prefer to address conflict in person, and it is especially easy to hide how you're feeling when you can hide behind a screen. All right, so Joe, let's start with you. So you agree?
Quickly, very quickly. I think at least my view on this is a segue from what Paul and Liam said on the last motion, which is trust, which really depends on believing what you don't understand, but the other told you so. Misunderstanding, for example, because of context-specific knowledge, that can lead into conflict. And it's that conflict, mostly cognitive. I know I'm not talking about political conflict. I'm talking about cognitive, not understanding the other. Has a lot to do with mistrust. And therefore, there's, I believe, a link between managing conflict and the psychological safety argument. So that's only my view. But again, I'm not an expert in small team or social psychology. So I would let that to Paul and Liam. Sure.
Paul, go ahead.
Joe, I'm not an expert in anything, so I'll still share my opinion.
Of course.
I disagree that either engaging in or effectively managing conflict is more or less likely with remote or in-person teams. I think leaders that struggled before dealing with conflict struggle today, and vice versa. And I think it's got more to do with personality type than remote or co-location. Some types dread confronting someone in real life, but can more easily manage that doing it remotely, and the reverse is also true. I think this is a preference, and it's something we can help people with skills, because there are undoubtedly a different set of skills to trying to move conflict forward over video to doing that in person.
Absolutely. Liam, what are your thoughts around conflict?
I think conflict with mistrust is a recipe for disaster. So if I can go into conflict with someone that I trust, generally I'm going to come out of that exchange not feeling mistrusted. Fundamentally, I have to trust the people that I'm going into conflict with. If I don't trust them, there's a big issue there, and we can't really have a healthy debate. And I think that conflict is important, and conflict should be encouraged. But you have to have that trust there, meaning, is this person actually aligned to the company goals that you're aligned to? Are we both moving in the same direction, and we just disagree about this small aspect of the way to be able to do it? That's the most important thing that I can really communicate to people. In terms of actually the context of it, really moving the hierarchy of communication up as much as possible is, to me, what I see as the most important. So generally for me, it is in-person is better than video, video is better than audio, audio is better than instant messaging, and instant messaging is better than email. If I've exchanged 10 instant messages with someone and we're not really getting it, and we're having almost like a conflict through Slack, I immediately try to jump up to the most interactive form of communication that I have access to. The vast majority of the time, that's a Zoom call, so that we can really work it out and I can see that person and communicate to them exactly how I'm feeling about this particular issue, and then get their feedback as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine conflict through letters.
Can I have a minute?
Absolutely.
Sorry, Marilyn, give me a minute.
Not at all.
On Paul's opinion, actually more than an opinion, on Paul's knowledge, I am completely in agreement. Actually, there is evidence that if you consider political conflict, so for example, our conflict has to do with both of us wanting a resource, and there's only the resource for one of us. For example, a promotion. Co-located teams that work in the same unit or in the same site or in the same company are much more likely to enter into political conflict than remote teams, because often people in remote teams are not part of the same site, the same unit. So they have actually different resources. So the likelihood of me entering now in conflict with Paul because we want some thing is very small. And you see, therefore, the likelihood of us getting into conflict is most likely to be cognitive, not political, or otherwise. Again, so that's why I'm saying I fully agree with Paul and I fully agree with Lian, which I think looked more into a sort of cognitive, but also emotional understanding that has to do with trust. So that was the minute I wanted to say.
No,
I think that's great. Marilyn, just one thing as well. There's an amazing book by a lady called Dr. Susan Scott, which is Fierce Conversations. It's quite old now, but the premise of this book, which I just love, is that every relationship at home and at work succeeds or fails one conversation at a time. And I think if you are remote or if you are in person, that stands. And so if you're always trying to have disciplined and kind and productive conversations, I think that stands you in really good stead to build that trust and to build those relationships and to be productive, whether you're remote or in person.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think your point about some people will always shy away from conflict and others won't is a very good one as well. And I always like to tell my team that conflict is a sign of love. You walk away from people you don't care about. And so if we're still having a disagreement, it's because we care enough and because we do intrinsically want to be aligned. Otherwise, we would just leave the room. And to Liam's point about this alignment question, it brings me to my next motion, actually, around team identification or organizational identification. And Joe, I'm really hoping you can talk to us about place as one of the elements of identity, but let me read it out for a minute. So team identification is defined as your sense of belonging to a team or to the organization that it belongs to, along with the positive emotional and evaluative investments one puts in that category membership. Higher levels of identification are associated in academic studies with increased cohesion, collective trust, a positive team climate, job satisfaction, engagement, and well-being for individuals. So the motion is remote teams have weaker team identification or organizational identification than co-located teams. This is due to the reduced visible, concrete, formal, and informal dimensions of team life that one can have in an office. And as a result, remote teams may suffer in terms of how much they identify with their organizations. All right, let's see. Maybe, Joe, I'll start you off so that you can walk us through your thinking around place and other aspects of the identity of organization.
Right. So I'm really unable to choose for or against the motion because, again, we belong to different scales of teams, right? Some of which are not teams, they're groups. So, I'm part of a team, but the team is part of an organization. The organization is part of a corporation. The corporation is part of a community. The community is part of a country. The country is part of the world. So the identification, a very strong identification to one level may be counterproductive because it means a lesser identification with the levels above or below. And that's why I have difficulty answering. And that's when place is very important. You see, as humans, we have always lived in a place. The moment there is trouble, we go home, right? I still remember I was teaching at INSEAD. I'm sorry to take 30 seconds. I was teaching at INSEAD, an executive program on September 11, when somebody came into the room and said, this is happening in New York. We have to stop. I came out. I saw the screens. And the first thing I did was I jumped into a car, went to the airport, and flew to my home in Porto, where I hadn't been for years. Don't ask me why. By the way, the next day, actually that night, flying in Europe was canceled, stopped. So you see, but my immediate reaction in the face of danger was to go back home. And I think actually home is the place we go to when things are wrong. So identification with home is quite important. And some people are so fortunate to have leaders that are able to make an office or a company a sort of home, not a substitute for the real home, but a sort of home. And that goes back to something Paul said quite a while ago about the quality of leadership. And sorry, I took too long. That's it.
No, not at all. I think that's a very beautiful point that you make. As a Lebanese who, it's really triggered me in the sense that I don't have a home I could go back to. It's quite fascinating, and maybe my company is my home these days. Paul, would you like to add to that?
I can add a little. I thought that was a great answer. I mean, I disagreed, but only because I disagreed with the absolute in the premise. I sound like a broken record on this. I know. Sorry. I really feel like team identity comes from the achievement of the team, comes from them feeling a place in the organization and the value that they add, comes from the relationships that are going on in the team, and come from the leadership. And I think that can be hugely successful in a remote setting or in an in-office setting. And the reverse is also true. It can be a disaster. And so I think with a great plan and with great execution and with great leadership and really great team members, then team identity is not location dependent.
Liam, what are your thoughts around that?
Boy, well, so first of all, Joe mentioning that whenever we get moved into conflict, we go back home, we go back to safety. One of the things that's important to take into consideration is when people work remotely, in the vast majority of cases, they actually are working from home. If there's a conflict that occurs up in my office here, the ability for me to be able to leave that environment, which may or may not at some points be quite toxic, really the only option is to go downstairs and to talk to my wife about some VP or some, chief level officer that's been creating problems in my life. And that's also something that we need to take into consideration when we have these types of healthy conflicts inside of an organization, is that safety that you might have been creating, that might have been at your home, is now getting infected by the conflict occurring directly inside of your home, which I think is a really important point to be able to touch on. And I thought to myself, man, I had the same issue. I was in British Columbia, which was on the other side of the country when 9/11 happened, and I almost wanted to jump into a plane and go back to French Canada, to Quebec, which is where I'm from, on the other side of Canada. And it was it's interesting how we both had that same kind of desire. You jumped on it and I didn't. And the very next day, all of the flights were closed. But, for me, having healthy conflict inside of organizations is absolutely critical. You need to have trust. You need to have this environment set up so that those conflicts are addressable. And I always say, hey, let's get rid of the elephants in the room here, and let's have board meeting conversations and not hallway conversations. Let's address these head on. As long as we're doing that, we're going to have a healthy organization, whether you're remote or on premise in office.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm not supposed to be adding anything to this, but on the topic of identification, being an architect, I find it also important to just, anecdotally, when I first started the company, I also created this wall behind me. It's now covered because we had a lot of conference-related themes, but it's actually the only artifact that I have that actually reminds me of place, in the sense that this wall is now representing our company. It's the only physical artifact in the real world that we have in terms of identification. And it is true that the office that we design, especially, of course, as always, and Paul's constantly reminding us of this, there has to be a deliberate choice. It's not like we just rented any damn office and walked into it. But if we do create these things with deliberate choice, there is so much that we can learn from being not necessarily just co-located with one another, but co-located in a space that was designed with intent, that can tell us a lot about how we're supposed to behave and how we are encouraged to create value. So I'm always somewhere in the middle, because actually my team is remote. We are global. We're in different cities, so are our clients. But at the same time, some parts of me, maybe also my high context, Oriental culture, pulls me back to some of these things that are tangible, that you can feel with your sentient body and not just with your mind or your brain. And so I first want to thank you all for a really balanced conversation. Paul, I did set this up as a UFC, but I'm glad you guys didn't take me up on that. And I'm really happy that you presented us with this complex perspective and diverse perspective on how to address these different issues within teams and within our roles as leaders. And certainly how we can create these safe spaces for our organizations moving forward. The burden is on managers to do that. And this is all really great advice for them. And so without further ado, I want to take us to the rapid fire round of our session, if that's all right. Let's do this alphabetically, so we can do Joe, Liam, Paul, for each of the following 5 questions. So the first question, we can start with Joe, is Joe, what's the skill that every leader needs to have today that wasn't as important before?
The ability to be at home in the world.
Oh, that's a beautiful one. Thank you, Joe. Liam, what's your answer?
Mine's more pragmatic, the ability to manage asynchronously.
Yeah, that's a hard one too, by the way. Paul, what's yours?
I would say writing and documentation is now a key skill, much more than ever before. But not in itself, as an enabler of non-linear work days and less meetings and just a work-life harmony that can be created.
Absolutely. Second question, what is the one book that every leader needs to read? Joe, what's your recommendation?
I wish I knew, and this is not the title of a book.
I'll accept that answer. Liam, what's yours?
Recent one I've loved is Radical Candor by Kim Scott.
Brilliant. Paul?
Seven's Heaven by Ben Ryan, the story of the Fiji Olympic gold medal win in sevens rugby.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think you might be the second person to recommend a rugby book. Yesterday, I don't know if you followed, but Sami, who was a professional rugby player, also did. Third question, what is the perfect song or music to work to? Joe?
Obvious to me, Fado.
Of course.
And interestingly enough, and don't ask me why, I don't know, French songs from the 60s and 70s.
I'll take it.
I don't know why. I just love it.
Liam, what about you?
Anything without lyrics. Lyrics really distract me.
Fair enough. Paul?
I agree with that. And my choice is Amazon Music do some great spa music channels that just happen in the background and really enable deep work.
Oh, brilliant. Next question. The perfect team size is? Joe?
3.
Okay. You want to tell me why? We're going to leave it there? Oh my God, I feel like we need a conversation about this number.
3.
One day. Liam, what's yours?
Coming from the entrepreneurial background, it's 0. If I can run the business with no people, that means more profits for me. But from a more pragmatic perspective, to me, anything that's really below the Dunbar number, so between 100 and 150 people, that's when people cease to become individuals and start to really become numbers inside of an organization. Generally, for me, I try to keep our companies below those numbers.
Fair enough. Paul?
Well, we're in trouble with 14,000 people then, I guess. But
they're not a team, so that's fine.
I would say one that achieves is able to achieve peak workload without everyone being a casualty of that workload. But during the normal days, they're able to deliver a great job and meaningful work and be able to achieve work-life harmony.
Brilliant. Thank you. And the last question for today is the future of teams is? Joe?
Great. Great in the sense that the future of teams is teams, and it's great. Teamwork. teamwork.
Yes, well, you might have picked up on the fact that in the previous panel, I was asked that question, and I said, I picked it up from last year's. You answered the future of work is work, and I answered the future of teams is teams. Liam, what's yours?
I'm going to change my answer, actually. I think that the future of work, remote work, really enables employers and employees to find the best of each other. And I think we're going to see a complete revolution and renaissance of global labor being able to enter the workforce in a way that has never been recognized in the history of civilization. So I'm very excited about the future of work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liam. Paul, what is the future of team?
I agree with both of those answers. Requiring return to real estate is forced co-location, is the company exerting a level of control that it can no longer do. The future of teams is bright.
Brilliant. On this very bright note, I really want to thank you and all of the panelists that we had over the 2 days of our conference. Everyone's brought in such amazing insights, and I know that me and my team will be spending a lot of time documenting them and thinking about how they help us help more people figure out what the future of team and work is for them. I'm super grateful for your time and for all of your brilliant ideas and contributions, and every single one of the Centaurs is also grateful. So is our audience. Thank you so much to the three of you and to everybody else for joining us. And this brings us to the end of our conference. Couldn't have hoped for more beautiful debate with a lot of humanity and discipline and kindness. Thank you, Paul. And thank you so much, everybody. And I guess Centaur out.
Thank you. Thank you so much.